A very important part of what's led me to being an artist the way that I am was going to Europe and studying these areas where they've always done glass manufacture. I worked with glass for a year and a half before I went there. And the reason why I went there in the first place was because I was interested in this story that I'd been told of it being this secretive, romantic oral tradition that was only passed on person to person. I think also what I was interested in is this idea of being an apprentice. And in Europe, that's still a very normal idea. And I didn't go there with any kind of goal in mind except to just experience that. The people I studied with were actually very much involved in the invention of mid-century modernism. So in some sense, they were very, very far from the deep past. In another sense, they were very close to it because the way they were working essentially was unaltered for hundreds of years. But they were in connection with these famous architects and designers and artists. They had figured out a way and been very instrumental in figuring out a way to adapt this tradition to make modern objects. I've made these works that were about this connection between a glass factory and the designs of Christian Dior, and they were displayed in an installation that was based on 1952 Venice Biennale. Those objects that were parts of that piece, they had to feel like a 1950s glass vase. They had to look like a figurine, and they had to look like the specific dress they were based on. And then they had to look balanced or not too ugly or not too, they had to have some kind of elegance. So a lot of times it's also too kind of, basic visual elegance or balance that I'm looking for. A lot of my work comes from memory in the sense that my work is a memory of objects. All of my work is essentially derived from some previous source at some level. A lot of times what I'm doing is sort of reimagining something or transforming it slightly, but it's always very much in connection to its source. I feel lucky that I have the opportunity to know how to make some things myself. I find it very pleasurable to really want to make a certain kind of thing and have an idea of how I want it to be, and then to get fairly close to that. Stop. It involves working with other people, and I like that aspect of it. You can't stop in the middle. It's like playing a piece of music. So, you have to be in its own time throughout the period of making it. It can be very, very frustrating. The problem is you can't touch it. If you could touch it, it would be relatively easy to do. So you have to manipulate it in other ways. There's this visceral thing that you actually haven't touched it. So once it cools off, overnight or something, I often have the feeling of even though I recognize that I made it, I don't really believe it until I take it out and handle it for a few days maybe, and then I start to okay, yeah, maybe I made that. One more, I think. For me, what being an artist offered was being part of a community of people interested in ideas, and that was really the reason from the beginning why I wanted to be an artist. I did this installation based on this famous bar that Adolf Loos designed the same year that he wrote this essay called Ornament and Crime. This famous essay describes how removing ornament from the world is more morally pure. Basically, it says primitive people are the people who decorate, that the natural course of progress in man is to remove this decorative impulse from our psyche. And it is about making the world white, in the sense of a world without ornamentation, without individuation, without grayness. Almost immediately, it falls apart and becomes something really, really horrible. And especially when it becomes imposed upon the world. Buckminster Fuller, the inventor of the geodesic dome, and Isamu Noguchi, the famous American sculptor, met in a bar in 1929 and had a conversation in which they kind of invented a new kind of abstraction, and it was an abstraction of total reflectivity. And it was based on the notion that if you placed a reflective object inside a totally reflective environment, that you would have this completely new kind of seeing and this completely new experience of form. For this particular project, I wanted to use this technique of silvering the inside of the glass so that it's totally reflective, to take advantage of this natural property of the glass creating this perfectly smooth surface. All a mirror is coating the backside of a piece of glass with a coating of metal so that the light reflects back at you. You pour silver nitrate on a piece of glass and it turns into a mirror. It's very simple, actually. Okay. A recent show that I did was titled Total Reflective Abstraction. There were 3 parts to it, 3 different rooms that each contained a different kind of approach to this notion. One was this project about Noguchi and Buckminster Fuller. I took Noguchi's forms and remade them as reflective objects, and I created a reflective environment mostly based on his furniture designs and proposals he did for abstract landscapes. The forms are reflective and their environment, the base on which they live, is reflective. They're about a kind of utopia. And they're the utopia of where everything is connected, everything is perfect seamless unity. But it was important for me that these are models. Something that's never intended to go beyond the model stage. One set of works were what I called mirror drawings, which were essentially just a sheet of glass mirror put directly on the wall. I made the glass itself, the piece of glass that became a mirror, and at one point in the process, I made this drawing with another kind of glass and then sandwiched it in with more glass on top. Then when you stand in front of them, then suddenly you see yourself, but you see yourself overlaid with this pattern. It was sort of this idea of this metaphor of what art is. The experience of art is a kind of fusion of your experience of yourself and of the object. In one of the other rooms is 2 competing versions of the history of 20th century design objects. The displays themselves are completely reflective on the outside and completely reflective on the inside, and then across the front is a piece of 2-way mirror. And the effect of this is that the objects on the inside of this are reflected theoretically infinitely, in the mirror in the backside of the case. You yourself are not reflected because it's a two-way mirror. The objects themselves are totally reflected. So the reflections move a little bit, but basically all these reflections in the objects stay totally still. So they have this very airless quality. The definition of being a modern person is to examine yourself, to reflect on yourself, and to be a self-knowledgeable person. So this is sort of a history of what it is to be 20th century. Here's these objects that represent culture that, that is around us, and then they're reflecting on themselves in an infinite regression, in a kind of, infinite narcissism. So they're sort of, yes, this is sort of what the 20th century was. I'm interested in the question of seduction, and I'm interested in the idea of how do you seduce people to be interested in what you've done. Seduction often involves presenting something in a very kind of sumptuous way, and that attracts people. I hope that my work functions to seduce you so that you want to look at it.
To learn more about Art21, Art in the 21st Century, and to download the free Educator's Guide, please visit PBS online at pbs.org. Art21, Art in the 21st Century is available on videocassette or with additional features on DVD. The companion book to the program is also available. To order, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.